So we see here in the beginning that the amount of track being laid by 1865, 35,000, compared to by 1900, 192,000, spanning a distance of 155 million acres, would just indicate how much we've developed in that short amount of time. So it's really going to emphasize the industrialization that's taking place in that period. And that land is being given to the railroad companies in alternate mile square sections. It allows the railroad companies to identify the routes that are going to provide or yield the highest grossing land. And until that was determined, those lands out west would not be available to any other settler. And Grover Cleveland is going to stop that, as he wants those settlers to gain access to those lands, because they're the ones that are going to create productivity and make the land useful. Throughout this period, we find the railroad companies really monopolizing that industry, and we see a couple of people leading that front. There are the big four: Leland Stanford, James J. Hill, and our notorious Cornelius Vanderbilt. They're the ones you should really pay attention to. Of all of them, Cornelius Vanderbilt is probably the most notorious one, because he's the one who's most successful and devious in his scheming towards creating a monopolized railroad. And that railroad is going to be benefited by some new technology. That would be the Westinghouse air brake, the Pullman Palace cars done by George Pullman, who has a company town that we'll come to learn about shortly. But nonetheless, they're being helped by the inventions of the period, making transportation a lot more viable and comfortable. And because the expansive routes were being developed throughout that period, they had to have a way to regulate and organize the railroads. And so they're going to have to develop time zones. So that's where we get that from. And the railroad are really the cause for the rise of the millionaire class. So keep that in mind. We do see here Jay Gould, our notorious gold embezzler or gold tycoon who manipulated the markets or tried to back in Grant's administration. Here he is again with a new method of increasing his wealth known as stock watering. It is the Enron of the 1880s. That's where you make your company look stronger or wealthier than what it is, and duping the consumer. And they were doing that by creating new organizations called pools or trusts that were really, in essence, large conglomerates that would monopolize an industry. And once you monopolized an industry, you could reap the profits by driving out competition and raising your rates. And that's what the Grange was really upset about. They are the small independent farmer who were victimized in this period. And they're going to sue with the Wabash case, and it's going to result in the Supreme Court ruling that interstate commerce is for the federal government to regulate, not the states as they were attempting. And that's going to lead to the development of the Interstate Commerce Act that will prevent the rebates, the pools, and require them to publish their rates openly, so not to prevent those small independent farmers like the Grange. That resulted in the Interstate Commerce Commission being established to enforce that. And despite the attempts of the government of regulating them and having that oversight, there are challenges in that period, and it won't really be successful till the early 1900s, so keep that in mind. But we do see here the Transcontinental Railway and its development, or its joining between the east and the western routes, and the golden spike that gets driven at Promontory Point, Utah. So that's an important date in history, or an important event, symbolizing the connectiveness of our country. Imagine, it only took about 7 days to cross the country, so one could inevitably, or in theory, have Christmas on the East Coast and then enjoy New Year's on the West Coast. Pretty impressive. Despite the fact that the travel time was greatly reduced, there were still a number of challenges. There were a lot of railroad destructions or deaths from accidents and so forth, so still somewhat tenuous. But in addition to the railroads and their developments and how much money they're reaping from this period, we also find some notorious entrepreneurs. People like Andrew Carnegie, who is going to establish a company called the U.S. Steel Corporation. And Carnegie rises from a low position immigrant all the way up to be the richest man in the United States. And he does it through his ingenuity and his driven effort, his focus. And in addition to Carnegie, we also have John Rockefeller. John Rockefeller, this guy right here, is the leader of the Standard Oil Company, a fierce competitor. He would drive out competition by providing oil at a cheaper rate. And the focus was, or the reason was, to drive out the competition and leave him standing. Once standing alone, he could raise the rates to whatever he'd like, and everybody would be forced to purchase it from him at that rate. So that's where these guys get the name, either robber barons, people who took advantage of the market, took advantage of the people and resources, or captains of industry, people who were actually forward-thinking and were just smart businessmen. And we're going to make that distinction later on in class, so keep that term in mind. But these two guys are utilizing these two theories called vertical and horizontal integration. Vertical being Carnegie. He would buy every component of the business process, the production method. He'd buy the railroad company to ship his product. He'd buy the mines to get the natural resources. He'd have the factories. He'd have every segment, thus cutting out the middleman, thus reaping greater profits. On the other side, Rockefeller was the horizontal. He would buy out the competition. If you're Burger King, he's buying McDonald's, he's buying Wendy's, he's buying KFC, and he's going to be the guy who owns the majority of the industry, both of which create monopolistic powers. And unfortunately for them, that goes against every principle of the American system, where we value competition. We want that competitive environment, and they were reducing it. That's where the robber baron concept once again plays in. We also have people like J.P. Morgan, who is going to have this theory or mechanism of interlocking directorates. Basically, he would put people on other companies' board of directors. He's a big banker, so he invested heavily. That gives him ownership of the company, and that gives him the right to put people on or in positions of power. Once he has them in those places, he can use them to manipulate the business's decisions so that he would benefit directly. Quite ingenious. He will eventually buy the U.S. Steel Company from Andrew Carnegie. Though he did not want to sell it to him, he will not be able to resist the $400 million price tag that Morgan offers him. And imagine, back then, no income tax, $400 million clear and free. Well, Carnegie never imagined having that much money, and he will donate over the course of his life $350 million to charities, pensions, and libraries. Specifically, libraries is one of the ones he's focused on most. And the purpose was to give people the means to improve their lives. And that's what drove him. That's the gospel of wealth, philanthropy. There's a responsibility for the upper class to help the lower class, not to just take advantage of them or reap their profits off the backs. And in addition to that, it also brings into the theory that the poor are poor because they're not doing enough of that hard work or driving to succeed. And the rich are rich because they have done those things. So it does raise an interesting question. And we will see in that period this acres of diamond speech that you'll see down here that indicates that story or shows us that. And we'll see a couple of examples of that in class. But just keep that in mind that at the moment, this is a pretty ruthless environment. So in addition to the number of industrial developments that are happening, we also have to focus on the South. And the South was still very focused on agriculture, and they're really lacking in their industry. Although they are starting to develop these type of companies. Anybody driving down 95, you would see it. The Philip Morris Company, the tobacco companies are all over the place. And they're focusing their efforts on those type of industries where people are urging them to industrialize, to take advantage of that time period and really gain some strength in that process. But they're lagging in that respect. So they are not going to be able to get to that same competitive advantage that the North has in that period, and it's going to continue to keep them somewhat deprived. We do see the Gibson girl. This is something that stands out. It's with all these new opportunities, specifically the job opportunities and the fashion, it denoted what a girl should look like. And it was proper, it was ephemeral. They had the 36-30, the slim waist, and it creates this image of a female. So that's kind of where that begins, and you're going to see the fashion move in that direction to help females become, not just more beautiful, but to stereotype it in a way, and look where it's taken us today. So the Gibson girl will be a part of that, noted by Charles Dana Gibson.